Imagine you're driving at 2 a.m. in the morning. There's nobody on the road, but the traffic light turns red. Do you stop? Most of us do. But why? Is it because it's moral to stop? Or because you're afraid of getting fined? That tiny decision captures one of the biggest questions in law. What is law, and why do we follow the law? Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this channel, we try to talk about everything related to the law, including asking the more philosophical questions like what is law and why do we follow the law? Now, this question of why we follow the law or what is law has fascinated me from the time I was in law school. And recently I published a little book that tries to answer this very question. This book has been a passion project of mine for the last 3 years or so, and I'm so glad that it's finally out there so that you can read it. If you're interested, you can download it as an ebook right now on Amazon or order it as a paperback version. I'll leave a link for it in the description below. In this episode, I thought we'll talk a little broadly about the question of what is law, which is essentially the thesis of this book. Let's get started. Just to give you a little context, this question of what is law is the central thesis of a subject we learn in law school, which is called jurisprudence. It's a mandatory subject for all of us who study law. But the beauty of this question is that there is no correct answer. Neither is there a wrong answer. Now, there have been many writers, or jurists as they're called, who have tried to answer this very question. Now, all of them have provided valuable insight as to what the answer to this question is, but nobody has been able to provide a conclusive answer so far. But it sounds like such a simple question, right? St. Augustine famously said, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to one that asks, I know not." The same logic applies to law. If nobody asks me, I 100% know what law is. But if somebody asks me to explain to them what law is, then I don't know how to explain it. Because I love this subject, I have also been teaching jurisprudence to law students for almost 15 years now. And at the first day of lectures, I always ask my new students a question. Why do you follow the law? I suggest you ask yourself the same question. Now, in addition to being a great icebreaker, this also brings about some fascinating answers. Some lean towards the argument that they follow the law because they are afraid of the punishment, while some believe that the law is valid because it's moral. And some others believe that you should follow the law simply because it's a set of rules that have been passed. What's fascinating is that without knowing, everybody aligns with a jurisprudential school of thought. They just don't know it. Let's say that you follow a law which says stealing is illegal because they prescribe the morally right thing to do. If you belong to this school of thought, which is called natural law, then you align with some of the oldest legal philosophers like Socrates or Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas or modern day writers like John Finnis. All these writers believe that law is valid because it stands on the side of morality. Now, there are two things to note here. Number one, what morality is has changed over time. For instance, the Greeks believed that morality was based on human reasoning, which is common to all humans, while Aquinas believed that morality was based on God. Now, despite these differences, they all believed that law was valid because it was moral. Number two, any law which was passed that did not satisfy this moral criteria would not be valid law and should not be followed. Think of a law that says kill all blue-eyed babies. According to natural law, this would not be a valid law, so we don't have to follow it. Now, this type of thinking is great. Following this kind of thinking, we can make sure that regimes like the Nazi regime and the law that they passed will not be considered valid because they passed law that was not moral. In fact, after World War II, during the Nuremberg Trials, Nazi officers defended themselves by saying that they were just following the law. The courts rejected the argument because those laws were immoral and therefore invalid under natural law thinking. But the obvious question that arises with this kind of thinking is, what about laws that are morally neutral? Imagine an offense like jaywalking. What's moral about this law? Where is the morality in crossing the road at a zebra crossing as opposed to anywhere else? Or stopping at a red light. What's moral about stopping at a red and going at green? And the other major criticism against natural law is that there is no universal metric on what morality is. It varies from person to person, from society to society, and from country to country. So if you can't agree on what morality is, then how can you base the law on it? Now let's look at the exact opposite of natural law. Let's say you follow the law because you're afraid of the punishment or because it has simply been passed by Parliament. Then you align with the positivist school of thought written by writers like Thomas Hobbes, Jeremy Bentham, John Austin, Hans Kelsen, and H.L.A. Hart, to name a few. Now, the central thesis of these writers is that law is valid because it's been passed by somebody who has authority to do so. So it doesn't matter if the law is moral or not, provided it's been passed by the right person. Remember during the pandemic when governments told us to stay indoors and wear masks? Some people argued that this was immoral, but positivists would say it doesn't matter. It's law because the right authority has passed it. And in some countries like Singapore, chewing gum in public is illegal. That law isn't moral or immoral, but under positivism, it doesn't matter. So technically, even a law that says kill all blue-eyed babies can be a valid law. Further, most of these writers believe that the law is valid because it's backed by a sanction or a punishment. One of the most famous thinkers who thought like this was John Austin. He says that law equals a command made by a political superior to a political inferior, which is backed by sanctions. This makes sense when you look at things like criminal law, which is always backed by a sanction, or laws like pay your taxes or you will be fined. All these laws are backed by a threat of punishment. But here's the problem with that kind of thinking. What about laws that do not have a punishment? Take a law which prescribes the formal requirements for getting married. There is no punishment in such a law, just a set of conditions to satisfy. Or a law which says how to create a last will. There's no punishment for doing it wrong. Some writers defend this position by explaining that if you don't follow these conditions, then the marriage or the last will be null and void, and that nullity is a punishment. But this argument has been criticized by many. So pause here and ask yourself, why do you follow the law? Do you lean more towards morality or more towards punishment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about this. Now, in addition to these schools of thought, there are many others. One of the more popular ones is Marxism. Marxism is a philosophy popularized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who believed that law is a capitalist tool used by the rich to control the poor. They believe that the rich, by virtue of their financial power, are able to control the ideological elements in society, such as religion, culture, politics, and law. And they use this power to control what law is, which will benefit the rich and oppress the poor. Think about the law on theft. The law says that you cannot steal. But who does that law benefit? Is it the rich who have everything to be stolen, or the poor who have nothing worthy of being stolen? Picture this. A man steals a loaf of bread to feed his starving children. Under the law, he's a thief. Marx would argue that the law is protecting the bakery owners and ignores the hunger of the poor. Or think about tax loopholes. The ultra-rich use them legally, while the average person pays their full share. Marx would say that the law is serving the needs of the rich and powerful. Marx argues that notions like justice and fairness are skewed in favor of the rich. So the law is simply an oppressive tool used by the rich to oppress the poor. Marx goes further and calls for a revolution by the poor. He believes that through this revolution you can establish a truly equal state. But of course, practical applications of this has shown that Marx's solution has not been successful. Another fascinating theory that tries to answer this question of what is law is feminism. Feminist legal theory makes the argument that the law has been created by men and is therefore biased against women. They argue that the experiences of women are ignored in the legislative process. Hilary Barnett explains that while there are many objectives in feminist jurisprudence, if there is one single unifying strand of thought among feminist legal scholars, it may be interpreted as the unmasking of the many inequalities based on gender encapsulated in the law. You don't have to look very far to find evidence of this inequality. It wasn't too long ago that women couldn't vote in many countries. This was because men wrote the laws and they decided that women were too emotional or irrational. While this may seem laughable today, a few decades ago, this was a valid basis on which women were disallowed the right to vote. Also, until the 1990s, a husband could not be found guilty for raping his wife. This was because the law assumed that the wife's consent was automatic. That's a very powerful example of how women's voices were excluded in the lawmaking process. Now, while the law may have improved over the last few years, discrimination against women through the law remains a real problem in society. So feminist legal theories calls for a rethinking of legal systems, eradicating this bias. Another interesting jurisprudential school of thought is utilitarianism. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill argued that the law should aim to achieve the greatest good for the greatest numbers. For example, speed limits might feel restrictive to individuals, but they reduce accidents overall, benefiting society as a whole. Therefore, it should be passed as law. It's a very practical way of looking at the law, which doesn't focus on morality or authority, but rather the outcomes of the law. Of course, there are many other fascinating legal theories, some of which I try to explore in the book, like liberalism, which focuses on the debate between freedom and equality, and things like Ronald Dawkins' interpretive theory. But I won't go into details on these theories now, I'll leave them for another episode. And of course, if you're interested, you can pick up a copy of the book. It's available as an ebook on Amazon or as a paperback on Amazon. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. So the next time you stop at a red light, or pay your taxes, or even stand in a voting booth, ask yourself, why are you following the law? Is it because it's moral, or because you fear the punishment? Or is the law serving an ulterior purpose, like benefiting the rich over the poor, or men over women? Anyway, that's it for this episode. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye.